Peeps by Scott Westerfeld, Chapter 9, Section 1. Underworld. Just as I finished Freddy's apartment, finding no glimmer of bodily fluids, my phone buzzed. One of the shrink's minders was on the other end, saying that she wanted to see me again. My stack of forms had returned from records, chock full of enough intrigue to bounce all the way up to the shrink. That was always a sign of progress. Still, I sometimes wished she would just talk to me on the phone and not insist on quite so much FaceTime. But she's so old school that telephones just aren't her thing. In fact, electricity isn't her thing. I wonder if I'll ever get that ancient. I took the subway down to Wall Street, then walked across. The shrink's house is on a crooked alley paved with cobblestones, barely one car wide. It's one of those New Amsterdam originals that the Dutch laid down 4 centuries ago, running on the diagonal, flouting the grid in the same grumpy way that the shrink ignores telephones. Those early streets possess their own logic. They were built atop the age-old hunting trails of the Manhattan Indians. Of course, the Indians were only following even more ancient paths created by deer. And who were the deer copying? I wondered. Maybe my route had first been cut through the primeval forest by a line of hungry ants. One thing about carrying the parasite, it makes you feel connected to the past. As a peep, I'm a blood brother to every other parasite positive throughout the ages. There's an unbroken chain of biting, scratching, unprotected sex, rat reservoirs, and various other forms of fluid sharing between me and that original slavering maniac, the poor human who was first infected with the disease. So where did he or she get it from, you may ask? From elsewhere in the animal kingdom. Most parasites leap to humanity from other species. Of course, it was a long time ago, so the original parasite positive wasn't exactly what we'd call human. More likely, the first peep was some early Cro-Magnon who was bitten by a dire wolf or giant sloth or saber-toothed weasel. I kicked a bag of garbage next to the shrink's stoop and heard the skittering of tiny claws inside it. A few little faces peeked out to glare at me. Then one rat jumped free and scampered a few yards down the alley, disappearing down a hole among the cobblestones. There are more of those holes than you'd think. When I first came to the city, I saw only street level, or sometimes caught glimpses of the netherworld through exhaust grates or down empty subway tracks. But in the night watch, we see the city in layers. We feel the sewers and the hollow sidewalks carrying electrical cables and steam pipes. And below that, the older spaces, the basements of fallen buildings, the giant buried caskets of abandoned breweries, the ancient septic tanks, the forgotten graveyards, and, struggling to get free underneath, the old stream beds and natural springs, all those pockets where rats and much bigger things can thrive. Dr. Rat says that the only creatures that ever come out onto the surface are the weak ones, the punks who aren't competitive enough to feed themselves down where it's safe. The really big things, the rat kings and the other alpha beasties, live and die without ever troubling the daylight world. Think about that for a second. There are creatures down there who've never seen a human being. The leaden sky rumbled overhead, and I smelled rain. History, nature, weather. My head was pounding, full of those big abstract words that have their own cable channels. But it was the sound of those tiny scratching feet inside the garbage bag that followed me into the shrink's house and down the corridor to her session room, pushed along by an invisible wind. Most impressive, Cal. She leafed through papers on her desk. All it took was a few drinks to get you back to Morgan's house. Yeah, but it was an apartment, Dr. Prolix. Not many houses in Manhattan these days, you might have noticed. The guy from records in the other visitor's chair raised his eyebrows at my tone, but the shrink only folded her hands and smiled. Still glum, but you're making such progress. I chewed my lip. The shrink didn't need to know what I was bummed about. Not that it mattered anymore, the whole stupid way I'd had Lace help me. Even if she'd gone on believing me, hanging out with her would have just gotten more and more torturous. Worse than that, it had been dangerous. Lace hadn't showed a bit of interest. Not that kind of interest, anyway, and I'd still come close to kissing her. Never again. Lesson learned. Move on. I was back in lone hunter mode now. Yeah, gallons of progress, I said. You saw what I found on the wall? I read your 1158S from this morning, yes. Well, I went back there today, but didn't find anything more on the creepy graffiti front, or much else. Morgan moved out at least 7 months ago. Not exactly an oven-fresh trail. Cal, 8 months is the blink of an eye for records. To find out where Morgan has gone, perhaps we should look at where she came from. What do you mean? The history of that property has proven interesting. She turned to the records guy and waved her pale hand. When the landlords in question filed their initial rent control forms, he began, there were 4 residents on the 7th floor. His voice quivered slightly, and once or twice as he read, his eyes darted up to the creepy dolls, confirming that he wasn't comfortable in the shrink's office. Not a hunter, just an average working stiff with a city job. His chair was backed as far away from the red line as it could go. No typhoid germs for him. We ran the names of these individuals through the city databases and hit a missing persons report from March this year. Only one? I asked. I figured they'd all be missing. He shook his head. More than one missing person from the same address, and we would have already filed an MP 2068 with you guys. But there was only one hit. NYPD has no leads, and at this point, it's pretty much a dead investigation. Given what I'd seen in Lace's apartment, that wording was appropriate. So let me guess. The guy who lived in 701 is gone? So pretty I just had to eat him? The man from records nodded. That's right, 701. Jesus Delonzo, age 27, photographer. He looked at me, and when I didn't say anything, he continued. Apartment 702 was occupied by Angela Dreyfus, age 34, broker. Where does she live now? He frowned. We don't exactly have an address for her, just a post office box in Brooklyn and a cell phone that doesn't answer. Rather anonymous, don't you think? The shrink said. And her friends and family don't think it's weird she lives in a post office box? I asked. We don't know, the record guy said. If they're worried, they haven't filed with the NYPD. I frowned, but the records guy kept going. A couple lived in the other apartment, 703. Patricia and Joseph Moore, both age 28. And guess what? Their mail forwards to the same post office box as Angela Dreyfus's, and they have the same phone number. He leaned back, crossed his legs, and smiled, rather pleased to have put such a juicy coincidence on my plate. But his last words hadn't even gotten through to me yet. Something else was really wrong. That's only 3 apartments. What about 704? He raised an eyebrow, looked down at his printouts, and shrugged. Unoccupied. Unoccupied? I turned to the shrink. But that's where Morgan lived. Her junk mail is still showing up there. The records guy nodded. The post office doesn't forward junk mail. But why don't you have a record of her? He leafed through his folder as he shook his head. Because the landlord never filed an occupancy form for that apartment. Maybe they were letting her live there for free. For free? Fat chance, I said. That's a $3,000 a month apartment. Actually, more like $3,500, the records guy corrected. Ouch, I said. The rent is not the most unsettling thing about that building, Cal, the shrink said. There was something else records didn't notice until you prompted them to look. The guy glanced sheepishly down at his papers. It's not anything we usually flag for investigation, but it is odd. He shuffled papers and unrolled a large set of blueprints across his knees. The building plan shows an oversized foundation, much deeper and more elaborate than one would expect. A foundation? I said. You mean the part that's underground? He nodded. They didn't have the air rights to put up a tall building because it would block views of the river, so they decided to make some extra space below. There are several sub-basements descending into the granite bedrock, spreading out wider than the building overhead. Room for a 2-floor health club, supposedly. Health club in the basement? I shrugged. Not surprising in a ritzy place like that. The shrink drew herself up. Unfortunately, this health club is not in a particularly healthy location. They excavated too close to the path tunnel, an area where the island is very porous. That tunnel was only finished in 1908. Not everything stirred up by the intrusion has settled yet. Not settled yet, I said. After 100 years? The shrink steepled her fingers. The big things down there awaken slowly, kid, and they settle slowly, too. I swallowed. Every old city in the world has a night watch of some kind, and they all get nervous when the citizens start digging. The asphalt is there for a very good reason, to put something solid between you and the things that live underneath.